Hello, YouTube. Got the whole leprechaun thing going right now. If you ever saw Wayne's World. Um, Mainly because I'm smoking a cigarette outside and there isn't much light out here, so I decided to make myself look as much like Satan as possible. Um, but the So this is a video response to the indefatigable theist um, about the issue of gay marriage. Um, she gives two arguments. Uh, she tries to not theologize the argument, which I sort of disagree. I think that there's still a theological tendency within it, right? I still don't think that. I think that even though she doesn't explicitly invoke God, it's you wouldn't see non-theists making this argument too readily. Um, so that's what I mean when I say that there's a kind of implicitly theistic dimension to it. But she gives she gives one, the one standard one, right? The God is, or not God, excuse me. The one standard one, the slippery slope argument, right? She says, if if love is the only basis for marriage, um, then what's to stop incest and pedophilia and stuff like this? The Old Testament sort of marriage. Um, Sorry, that was a passive aggressive jab. Uh, so what's to stop us from slipping back to our Genesis ways? Well, I think one is first of all, incest is a self-regulating phenomenon, right? So we find that horrific genetic disorders emerge from incest. So it's a non-starter, right? There's no way to sanction incest. Um, uh, Pedophilia was the other one, and I think that what she's missing is that nobody is arguing for um, nobody is arguing for marriage solely based on love, right? Um, it's it That love has to be symmetrical, right? It has to be requited. It has to be between two consenting adults. Um, there has to be this dimension of consent, so that she's smart enough to not go down the line of why wouldn't you marry animals and stuff like that. But I think that the applies in the case of pedophilia, that we recognize that there's a certain age, usually 18 in the United States, for instance, that's conceived of as the age to which at which you sort of become a member of society who can make choices, right? The training wheels kind of come off. This is you can consent to things at the age of 18, and you're fully constituted as a citizen at the age of 21 with booze. Um, so yeah, this is the safeguard. Um, it's not just love; it's love steeped in consent, particularly given the fact that, insofar as the state's concerned, insofar as marriage is conceived of as a legal category, you need to be 18 to enter into contracts as it is, and as such, you know, marriage doesn't legally get off the ground. Then, in order to change marriage to allow for pedophilia, um, you would have to change the entire legal apparatus that governs contracts. So that seems much more involved than than she thinks. Um, the other argument that she gives is an argument from the burden of proof, which is an interesting argument to me because it betrays um, sort of it betrays a certain way of conceiving of of politics and law, right? So law is something that's sort of universally in the history of political theory regarded as something that's coercive, right? It limits your actions, it limits your behaviors, it limits the actions of the individual, and as such, to put a law into place that restricts people's actions is the burden of proof is always on that law, right? So, for instance, if I were to write a law that says, that if I were to legally bring the category of the stoplight into existence, right? That law, I think, is justified. And if someone were to point to the stoplight and say, well, why this? I just want to be able to run through every street at all times. You could build a case, a rational case for why, we have this legal category. This is implicit in law, right? The burden of proof is always on the laws that are in place. It's not that it's not ever that this law is in place, and if you want to challenge it, you have to have a good argument, but I don't need a good argument because the burden of proof is on you. Like, that logic never works in law, right? If a law exists and is challenged, just in order to conceive of law as a non-coercive instrument, it must be the case that that law can be supported and justified against challenges, right? This is, Rousseau talks about how the law has to be self-legislated, basically. This is how political theorists get around the objection that law limits freedom, right? Because that's obviously true, right? But the fact is, the law is only there insofar as it's justifiable. So it's not the same. So the burden of proof here doesn't function the same way as it does with existence claims, for instance. Or it actually kind of does, because if we say that the burden of proof relates to the null hypothesis, then it kind of does refer to that, right? But it's assumed that a law should not be there at all times, and if you need it to be there, then you have to justify it. In the same way, it's assumed that any given phenomenon does not exist until you justify the existence of that phenomenon, or demonstrate is probably the better term. So yeah, this is how burden of proof works. This is, sort of political theory 101. So there were those two, and also she gives another argument that I think is the most common one, that if you change the structure of marriage and how that's conceived in society, then you necessarily change our relation as a culture to marriage. You change what marriage entails, of our relationship of responsibility to marriage. You change the family as such, right? This sort of constellation of ideas shifts in relation to marriage, or in relation to saying that marriage should be legal, or ought to be. I think that's true. Actually, I think that that constellation does necessarily have to shift in how we conceive of the family. Necessarily changes when we change the structure of what is and isn't allowed. She uses, I think she's quoting a Supreme Court justice, when we make marriage a non-gendered institution, which I think is a fair way to think about it. Yeah, I think that does change what marriage is and what the family is. But what you then do that I don't see the support for is to assume that that's a bad thing, right? Like, it seems to me that the only way that you can assume that that's a bad thing is theologically. I don't think that you can um, make that case on secular grounds, or in some way I would challenge you to make that case on secular grounds. Um, we don't, in countries where gay marriage is legal, for instance, we don't see the effects that you describe, that people look at having a family as a convenience and throw duty out the window, for instance. That doesn't, that's one that in particular you mentioned. I don't see any reason to suggest that just because the concept of marriage changes, the notion of duty to family goes out the window entirely. And the other thing too is that I think that the gay marriage debates uh, and the rise of gay marriage in the United States and in the first world in general. Um, this is my central argument against gay marriage, right? I think that the rise of it and the rise of this argumentation has introduced a crack into the traditional conception of marriage, sort of historically and conceptually. There's a crack, right? What was once unthinkable, being gay marriage, is now thinkable, and indeed, in a certain way, kind of commonplace, or it's already a part of it, right? So in structural terms, in structuralism, there's this idea: the possibility once is a necessity forever, right? And which is what makes the idea of original sin so interesting from a structuralist perspective. The possibility once is a necessity forever, right? So the possibility of gay marriage once, that shift has already taken place. The law is just catching up at this point, right? So I don't think, no matter what you do, no matter what arguments you deploy, no matter how you try to approach the subject, I don't think that there's any way of going back to some imagined past where we can be all Leave It to Beaver, right? That we can conceive of marriage in this traditional way. So I think, in my view, the fight's not only is your fight already lost, but it's been lost for a long time, and on top of that, it's there is no going back. And I don't think it would be preferable to go back. I think the idea that we should be going back is based on some, idealized past that never actually existed. But yeah, so those are my issues with your video. And yeah, have a good night.